Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Tabletop Show. Today we're taking a look at my favorite role-playing game system out there, which is World of Darkness. Now, this is just a basic overview. I'm not going to go into really big specifics with each individual game because there's a lot of sub-games for World of Darkness. I'm going to give you a general idea of how the game is going to play, and I'm going to give you an idea of what you should expect from the sub-games in terms of just their general idea. Now, World of Darkness itself started in the early 90s, basically. And the most known game with it is Vampire the Masquerade, hands down. And there's a very good reason for that. It really is the best of the bunch when you get down to it. Vampire the Masquerade is extremely lore-heavy, and if you have played Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines or Redemption, for those of you who go back a bit further, then you're going to find that you have a general idea of how old World of Darkness is supposed to feel. Now, there's two different main versions. You have Old World of Darkness, which is my way of saying Classic World of Darkness, or CWOD as it's usually referred to. And there's New World of Darkness, which started in, I believe, 2006 with the release of Vampire the Requiem. Now, I hate Vampire the Requiem, but I really like the changes they made to the mechanics of New World of Darkness. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. You're going to find that certain people are going to prefer the new version, some people are going to prefer the old version. But if you're a vampire fan, you're almost certainly going to prefer Vampire the Masquerade. And there's a good reason for that. If you play the video games, you understand that. It's extremely lore-heavy, it's extremely dialogue-heavy, very story-driven. And that is exactly what World of Darkness is supposed to be. It's not very mechanics-heavy, it is very social and story-heavy. In fact, the system itself is called the Storyteller system. And that really does speak volumes for what you should expect in terms of mechanics. Mechanically, Old World of Darkness was a bit of a mess. Had a lot of different stats and skills. And New World of Darkness basically simplified a fair bit of that and introduced a few tweaks here and there that I'm not really going to get too much into, because this is just a general overview anyway. But the thing is, there's a lot of sub-games for World of Darkness. In fact, I have them all listed here. And I have them listed by CWAD and NWAD, or you see in here parentheses COD. That is not Call of Duty, obviously. That would be ridiculous. That is Chronicles of Darkness, which is what World of Darkness got rebranded to. And you can see there's a lot here. Now, your three main games with both of the World of Darkness series are Vampire, Werewolf, and Mage. Most well known as Vampire. And you're going to find that each of these different games has their own different quirks. I'm only going to give you a general idea of what to expect from each of these here. I'm not going to go into specifics. But suffice to say, my personal favorite of the bunch is Vampire the Masquerade. I absolutely love Vampire the Masquerade. It is fantastic. And if you do get a chance to play it, I very highly recommend you play it. The thing is, it's not the kind of game, and all of these games really, are not the kind of thing that your average D&D player is going to like. D&D is extremely gamey. It is very much a tabletop game, not so much a role-playing game. World of Darkness emphasizes role-playing, and that's not for everyone. If you're not big on social aspects, if you're not big on lore, then this is not going to be the series of games for you. In fact, my general rule of thumb with World of Darkness is, if you're in combat, you have probably done something wrong. Not necessarily, but you've probably done something wrong. So, that's something to keep in mind when it comes to World of Darkness. It's for a kind of specific kind of gamer, and that's exactly what I am. I'm a very big fan of role-playing aspects in role-playing games, rather than the gamey aspects of them. That's why I can't stand playing D&D, for example. Now then, let's go ahead and go through each of these and just give you a general idea. Now, you're going to see that pretty much all of these have a counterpart in both CWAD and NWAD. Now you have Vampire the Masquerade, which was redone into Vampire the Requiem. I hate Vampire the Requiem. It is terrible. They ruined the lore completely. Do not bother with Vampire the Requiem. If you want to use the NWAD mechanics with Vampire the Masquerade, there is a conversion guide available, because I actually prefer the mechanics of New World of Darkness. They're streamlined, they're more accessible, they make more sense. But when you get to CWAD, the lore was generally a bit better in CWAD. They had more traditional sources. In fact, they had this very different vibe. When you get to New World of Darkness, it has a more modern horror vibe. When you go to Old World of Darkness, it was that kind of interesting gothic punk vibe that hasn't really been replicated since. And it's most well known with things like, say, The Crow. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. That's actually a pretty damn good movie. But that kind of vibe, if you've seen The Crow, then you'll have a general idea of how pulpy yet also atmospheric World of Darkness was back in the day. And Vampire is not anywhere near the garbage that we see from vampires these days, like, say, Twilight. No, these are the vampires that are totally badass as hell. And even when you get to Vampire the Requiem, they were still badass as hell, it's just that the lore was terrible. So, Vampire is the kind of the flagship of World of Darkness. If you're gonna play a single World of Darkness game and nothing more, make it Vampire the Masquerade. Trust me on that. The other ones are more particular. Now, I will readily admit that out of the old World of Darkness games, the only one I have actually played any considerable amount of is Vampire. All of the other ones I've seen to some degree, but I haven't really gotten involved in. As far as New World of Darkness goes, I have messed around with Vampire a little bit. I have looked into these other ones here. I own a copy of Demon the Descent. I've messed around a little bit with Mage, and I've looked a little bit into Werewolf, Changeling, and a slight degree of Hunter. Hunter is stupid when you get to New World of Darkness, but it's just, when you get to Hunter, that's just emphasizing combat, and combat is not something that World of Darkness is good at. So, that's kind of a mess. This one right here, Deviant the Renegades, is actually an entirely new one, and it's under the Chronicles of Darkness branding, and I have no idea what this is about at all, because they haven't released it yet. So they are still actually publishing stuff for it. But when you get to all of these, most of them have an analog. Vampire, Vampire, Werewolf, Werewolf, Mage, Mage, obviously, and Changeling, and Changeling. Then you get to Wraith the Oblivion, which basically got rebranded into Geist the Sin Eaters, and Geist is pretty cool. I haven't really looked into Wraith, but Geist is interesting because you are basically a spirit that has infested a human, so to speak. The idea is that when you died, it was some particular method of death that you were not remotely ready for. You were basically trying to claw back into the living world, and this spirit said, hey, I'm going to attach myself to you and give you power and bring you back to life, but now you got to deal with me. Effectively, that's grossly simplifying it, but that lends itself really well to things like, say, Murdered Soul Suspect, where you're looking into spirit-related crimes and stuff like that. It's a pretty cool setting. I haven't really been able to mess around with it, but it's a really cool idea, and I'd love to be able to get a game of that running. I haven't really messed too much with Mummy. I know a few things about it, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Mummy. Those are all pretty self-explanatory. Wraith and Geist are pretty much the same thing, like I said. Spirits. You're basically spirits of death at that point. Hunter, obviously, you are monster hunters, and that's why it's not really that great. It's one of those things where, again, if you're playing World of Darkness and you're playing a combat-heavy game, you're doing it wrong. And then there's Demon. Demon is interesting. I've only looked at it from the New World of Darkness perspective. But Demon, you are a fallen angel. And in the New World of Darkness version, I don't know about the Old World of Darkness version, but the New World of Darkness version, basically, God in that is a machine. It is known as the God Machine. And it is not benevolent in the slightest. And demons are ludicrously powerful beings. Basically, if they unleash their powers, then all hell breaks loose. So the entire game is basically you trying to hold in your powers and not unleash them while still trying to defy the God Machine. It's an interesting idea. I'm not entirely sure how it works, though, because again, I've only barely looked into it. This is only a general idea of how the system works again anyway. Haven't really looked into Beast. It's one of the newer ones. Beast and Deviant, neither of those have I really been able to get much info on, because I mean, the people I know who play World of Darkness mostly played Old World of Darkness, or they played the very early bits of New World of Darkness. The thing about New World of Darkness is that you kind of have to be specific with which game you're going to play, because if you try to do a mixed game, then it doesn't work, because everyone's always at odds with one another. Vampires and werewolves hate each other, for example. They will just try to kill each other whenever they possibly can, effectively. So that's just a prime example of that. It's really hard to get people to agree on a specific game if they aren't really exposed to World of Darkness all that much. And with the quote-unquote old-timers, most of us are going to be playing Vampire the Masquerade anyway. So it's a bit of a shame that these other games don't really get as much time, but if you do get a chance to play them, I would recommend, at the very least, look into Mage, because Mage is really cool. Basically, you're bending reality to your will, and sometimes reality bends back. It's interesting, to say the least. Changeling, I've never really managed to look too much into, because they were full of tables upon tables upon tables of different contingencies, and I was just like, no, this is not my thing. But the idea there is you're shapeshifters, effectively. So that's pretty cool. But mostly you're going to be playing Vampire with regards to this, as far as what's going to be available to you. Again, if you can get in one of the other games going, then more power to you. I will have a link in the description box to where you can pick up the books if you're interested, because there's a lot of material available for the Old World of Darkness stuff, not so much for the New World of Darkness. It really depends on how popular that particular game was. And something else you're going to notice with these particular games is that all of them do have one common theme, except for Hunter. And that is dealing with the fact that you aren't human, at least not completely. You are some supernatural being. You are effectively a monster. And in fact, in the case of Vampire in particular, you're going to find that that's going to constantly conflict with the fact that you're trying to maintain some semblance of humanity. And that's pretty interesting. It's that idea of, well, if you're a monster, then what does it mean to be human, as well as how do I still maintain that humanity while I'm being this monster that has to drain the blood of people to survive? It's interesting. It presents some cool moral dilemmas that you can run into, and you also have this idea of going too far. Because if you go too far, then you become that monster and bad things will happen to you. But you'll also be able to get some more power as well. So, it's kind of a trade-off. It's an interesting idea at any rate. That said, let's talk about the system itself. Now, the basic idea here is you're using only D10s. And you have a bunch of different stats and skills on your character sheet that are filled in with dots. And the dots represent how many dice you're going to be putting into a pool. So you're going to roll a skill, and that skill is going to take the dots from your stat, and it's also going to put dots from your skill in there. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, you get 7 dice for your pool. So you're going to take your 7 dice, and you're going to roll it. And then you're going to look at each of these dice here. So let's see what we got. We have 2 1s, 2 8s, a 7, a 6, and a 3. Now, of these, in the Old World of Darkness rules, you had to be really careful with the 1s, because a lot of people used a 1s cancel rule. I've never really noticed an official rule for 1s cancel in the actual books. It's kind of one of those things like natural 1s, in D&D. It's one of those house rule kind of things. Because if you roll a 0, then that's a critical, basically. But usually the target number is somewhere around a 7 or an 8. Sometimes more, sometimes less. So let's just say for the sake of argument that the target number was 7. So you roll at or above the target number. These are successes. These are failures. These are critical failures. These you basically compare to how many successes you got. So we got more successes than we got critical failures. Therefore, we succeeded, but only with 1 success, basically. Otherwise, you're basically looking at how well you succeed. The more successes you get, the better. The less failures you get, the better. The less critical failures you get, especially the better. Now then, the way that New World of Darkness handles it is that it doesn't really have the ones canceling out the successes quite as much. Instead, they made the target numbers higher, and so in this case, only these 2 would actually be successes. Because all these are failures. The standard difficulty in New World of Darkness, if I remember correctly, is it should be an 8. Which means that you're only going to succeed about 30% of the time. It's kind of interesting. But obviously with different degrees of success means different degrees of bonuses. So that's kind of an interesting system. And you can probably see right there why it doesn't really lend itself all that well to combat. If everything is using a dice pool of d10s, and everything's based on a skill roll, because weapon rolls are also based on skill rolls, then it's going to be a bit messy. Now, it gets particularly messy when you get to things like vampires, which are really only vulnerable to fire, or the sun. Now, if they get in the sun, then they basically disintegrate. But fire burns the living crap out of them. You have basically 3 different types of damage. And one of them is bashing, which is just kind of blunt force trauma. Then you have killing damage, which is going to be stuff like gunshot wounds and such like that. And then you have aggravated damage. That is the hardest to heal, and it is the most dangerous as a result. Fire does aggravated damage to vampires, whereas gunshots actually only do bashing damage. So it's interesting to see the different strengths and weaknesses come into play, but you can also, again, see where that would probably get pretty messy during combat, and it does. You'll have a bunch of characters taking full shotgun blasts to the face and just not actually being affected by it because their soak is too high or something like that. This is why I don't really like getting into combat situations in World of Darkness, because usually it just drags on and on if you've got even normal humans, for example, having a really high soak because of various bonuses from armor and skills and stuff like that. And what ends up happening is they'll, again, take full shotgun blasts to the face and be perfectly fine because their soak was too high. That sort of thing doesn't really happen as much in New World of Darkness. It's one of the improvements they made to the system. But at the same time, you have the issue of, well, they didn't really quite fix the combat system in New World of Darkness. It's still the same. You take turns, you have an initiative order, and of course you have your dice pools, and you're rolling against other people's skills. It's a pretty straightforward system. You're basically rolling successes against successes and that sort of thing. And again, it works, but combat just sucks. I really don't recommend getting in combat if you can avoid it. And this also means that GMing for World of Darkness can be a bit of a nightmare, particularly if you're playing one of the really lore-heavy ones, because there's a lot to memorize and there's a lot to keep track of. So you may not know off the top of your head, for example, what a Tzimisce is, or you might not know what the Sabbat are, and that's something you're going to need to know, because they're massive things in the vampire lore in particular. Now, part of the fun with World of Darkness is just feeling like you've gotten wrapped up in something much bigger than you, and feeling like you, no matter how powerful you actually are as your character, feeling like you're actually completely outclassed, and that you've gotten your nose into something that it doesn't belong in. And that sort of thing is incredibly amusing. So, for example, if you are playing a vampire game and you just have your party running into, all of a sudden, one of the antediluvians. Well, at that point, you're like, oh crap, because those are being so far beyond your power level that, well, they could basically flick their wrist at you and you die instantly. So, it's those sorts of things that make Vampire and other World of Darkness games interesting. This constant idea of, hey, I'm getting my nose into something where it doesn't belong, and I'm going to suffer repercussions for it, but the ride is going to be really interesting. There's all kinds of weird, wacky stuff in World of Darkness. Things like derangements that you can get. Your characters can be insane. And, in fact, if you're playing a Malkavian in Vampire the Masquerade, then you are insane. And it's beautiful, because your derangement will constantly come up at the absolute worst times and all kinds of crazy nonsense will happen. Keep in mind, if you haven't played Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, one of the things you can do as a Malkavian in that is have a full conversation with a streetlight. And I do mean an actual lamppost. It's very amusing. And it's just those kind of things that make World of Darkness all kinds of fun. That incredibly dense lore is really going far to actually make the world come alive. And it doesn't feel like something that is just going to be a game for you to mess around with. It's really the world building and the character interactions and just the storytelling in general that are going to really drive a World of Darkness game. Because mechanically, this is all you got right here. Dice pools. A bunch of dice that you roll all at once. You count up the successes, you count up the failures and the critical failures, and you go from there. And that's pretty much it, really. The combat rules are a bit more complicated than what I've gone over here, but again, if you're playing World of Darkness and you're getting into combat a lot, then you're probably doing something wrong. But I only wanted to give you a general overview here. I didn't want to go too deep into the mechanics because there really isn't all that much to them. They're pretty straightforward, they're very easy to learn, and particularly if you've played Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, then it's actually pretty accessible. Because you'll have a general idea of how the system works from that, but at the same time, you'll have that introduction to the vampire world that you wouldn't ordinarily get if you were playing the tabletop. So, if you want a good starting point for the series, without actually getting into the tabletop itself, then play Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Not only is it a fantastic game, but it's a fantastic introduction to the world of World of Darkness. As far as the mechanics of the tabletop go, though, dice pool. You're good to go. Character sheet is easy to read. There's nothing too particularly crazy about it. I mean, you've got your various stats for what is effectively your mana in the game. And, for example, Vampire the Masquerade or Vampire the Requiem, it's blood points. And in others, it's mana or essence or things like that. You have willpower or humanity or any number of these other stats. And again, the stats are going to change depending on what game you're playing. Because certain games have certain skills that others don't. Some of them have certain powers that others don't. Some of them have completely different ways of interacting with the world than others do. And, for example, if I go to this, and one that's actually missing here that I forgot to put in is Promethean. The Created, if I can spell. Promethean, you're basically playing a Frankenstein's monster. And you are an abomination of nature, which is definitely interesting. Promethean's pretty depressing. In fact, a lot of these are a little depressing. They are very overbearing in the atmosphere, and they can be pretty inaccessible to someone who's fairly happy-go-lucky or who just isn't into horror. So if you're into horror and tabletop RPGs are your thing, and you're big into storytelling and character interactions, and not so big into the mechanics, World of Darkness might be for you. But if you're somebody who loves D&D because you get to go into a dungeon and smack around a few skeletons to get your +4 longsword of failure, then, well, let's face it, you're not going to like World of Darkness. Because it's not gamey enough for you. It's not combat heavy enough for you. Dungeon crawling is a thing in World of Darkness, but it's a very rare thing. But that's kind of the charm, really, because when you get down to it, I would much rather play a game like this than a game where all I'm doing is dungeon crawling anyway. At any rate, I will have links in the description box where you can check out some of the books if you're interested. It'll be on the DWTerminator site. They have a lot of really good stuff on there. Most of the catalog, in fact. So I would recommend checking that out if this has piqued your interest. And I do understand that this is a bit of a simplistic overview. I didn't want to go too far into the mechanics, because honestly it's been a long time since I played World of Darkness anyway. It's pretty hard for me to get a group of this going, because I don't really know all that many people who are actually into World of Darkness. And most people I know who are into tabletops are into more gamey tabletops than this. So that's a bit unfortunate, but oh well. I kind of live with it. So your mileage may vary on that. You may be able to find the perfect group for this kind of thing, and if you can, then go for it, because it's a very different experience than what you would get with basically any other tabletop RPG. And on that grounds alone, it's definitely worth looking into. But just keep in mind that you're going to need to pick the specific game that's going to suit you and your group. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to have all kinds of problems. So, also a word of warning, don't do a mixed game. Do not try to mix in vampires and werewolves and mages and such like that. It's not going to work. You can maybe get, say, mages and geists working together. You might be able to get hunters and some other semi-human character going, but more likely than not, you're just going to run into problems, because a lot of these different groups are going to hate each other. And it's because they all represent different things. Werewolves are guardians of nature. They don't like abominations of nature. So there's only so much you can do there. And that's something you're going to have to keep in mind. It's not going to play well with the other games. More likely than not, if you're playing a vampire game, a werewolf is going to be an antagonist. So if you're going to have a werewolf in the campaign at all, they're probably going to be at your throat. And they're actually incredibly dangerous as well, so just keep that in mind. But other than that, again, if this has piqued your interest in World of Darkness, I would recommend checking it out, because, again, it's my favorite system. And unfortunately, I haven't played it in so long that I'm actually starting to forget the exact mechanics of it. So that's a bit of a disaster when you get down to it. But, oh well. There's a lot to offer with World of Darkness. Lots of different games. Basically one for everybody when you really get down to it. As long as you're into horror anyway. But if you're not into horror, you probably won't be able to get much out of it. Anyway, I hope this was interesting to you. And give me suggestions for more of these type of videos, what you want to see from the Tabletop series in the future. Because I definitely need some direction on where to go with this. I'm probably going to take a look at each of the individual World of Darkness games eventually, but I'm not sure when or in what capacity I'll be doing that. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. But until then, and until next time, and whatever suggestions you give me would be greatly appreciated. But until next time, I'll catch you guys in later videos.